episode 218 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the most complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week, we're continuing in Book 2 of Cicero's Own Ends, and we're in section 28. The book is largely devoted to Cicero's attacks on Epicurean philosophy, and this week we're going to be continuing the discussion of the last several weeks in which Cicero is trying to go through Epicurus's approach to pleasure and point out things that Cicero thinks are contradictions or discrepancies and just things that make no sense to Cicero. Last week, we focused mostly on this issue of whether pleasures can be made better by additional time and so forth. Epicurus had held that infinite time does not contain greater pleasure than limited time does. Cicero is going to expand that this week. And we did, as Joshua mentioned in the last episode, discuss many of the same issues we're going to be touching on today. But it's really so important that it deserves the scrutiny. So let me introduce what Cicero says in section 28 here, and go through it real quickly. So in the Reed edition at the bottom of page 67, Cicero's talking to Torquatus and he says, "Come, you'll say to me, these are small matters. The wise man is enriched by nature herself, whose wealth, as Epicurus has taught us, is easily procured. His statements are good, and I don't attack them, but they're inconsistent with each other. He declares that no less pleasure is derived from the poorest sustenance, or rather from the most despicable kinds of food and drink, than from the most rare dishes of the banquet. If he declared that it made no difference to happiness what kind of food he lived on, I should yield him the point and even applaud him, for he'd be asserting the strict truth. And I listen when Socrates, who holds pleasure in no esteem, affirms that hunger is the proper seasoning for food, and thirst for drink. But to one who judges everything by pleasure, lives like Galonius, but talks like old Piso Frugi, I do not listen, nor do I believe that he says what he thinks. He announced that nature's wealth is easily procurable because nature is satisfied with little. The pleasure, he says, it is obtained from the cheapest things is not inferior to that which is got from the most costly. To say this is to be destitute not merely of intelligence, but even of a palate. Truly, those who disregard pleasure itself are free to say that they do not prefer a sturgeon to a sprat. But he who places his supreme good in pleasure must judge of everything by sense and not by reason, and must say that those things are best which are most tasty. But let that pass. Let us suppose he acquires the intensest pleasures, not merely at small cost, but at no cost at all, so far as I'm concerned. Let the pleasure given by the cress, which the Persians used to eat, as Xenophon writes, be no less than that afforded by the banquets of Syracuse, which are severely blamed by Plato. Let the acquisition of pleasure be as easy, I say, as you make it out to be. Still, what are we to say about pain? Its agonies are so great that a life surrounded by them cannot be happy, if only pain is the greatest of evils. Why, Metrodorus himself, who is almost a second Epicurus, sketches happiness almost in these words: a well-regulated condition of body, accompanied by the assurance that it will continue so. Can anyone possibly be assured as to the state of this body of his? I don't say in a year's time, but by the time evening comes. Pain, then, that is to say, the greatest of evils, will always be the object of dread, even though it be not present, for it may present itself at any moment. How then can the dread of the greatest possible evil consort with the life of happiness? Someone tells me Epicurus imparts to us a scheme that will enable us to pay no heed to pain. To begin with, the thing is in itself ridiculous that no attention should be given to the greatest of evils. But pray, what's his scheme? The greatest pain, he says, is short. First, what do you mean by short? Next, what by the greatest pain? May the greatest pain not continue for some days? Look to it that it may not continue for some months even, unless possibly you refer to the kind of pain which is fatal as soon as it seizes anyone. Who dreads such a pain as that? I wish rather you would alleviate that other sort, under which I saw that most excellent and most cultivated gentleman My friend Gnaeus Octavius, son of Marcus, wasting away, and not on one occasion only, or for a short time, but often and over quite a long period. What tortures did he endure, ye eternal gods, when all his limbs seemed on fire? Yet for all that we did not regard him as wretched, but only as distressed, for pain was not to him the greatest of evils. But he would have been wretched if he had been immersed in pleasures while his life was scandalous and wicked. Okay, so that's 28, and it sets up for us this discussion again about being able to distinguish between greater and lesser pleasures and greater and lesser pains. Cicero has cited examples of types of food which some people will say are clearly more tasty than others. He's talked about pains clearly worse than others, and he's saying, Epicurus, why are you trying to tell me that all pleasures are the same, that all pains are the same, and that you can deal with pains because the worst pains are short and other pains are manageable over time? That doesn't even make any sense because that's not our experience in the world, Cicero was saying. So let's first deal with the question of, did Epicurus in fact, as Cicero says near the beginning of 28, declare that no less pleasure is derived from the poorest sustenance, or rather from the most despicable kinds of food and drink, than from the rarest and finest dishes of the banquet? Did he in fact say that? Because we have on the forum one of our closest friends, Don, who has written clearly that he prefers eels to other types of fish. Now, is Don being an improper and insufficient Epicurean by saying that eels appeal to him more than, for example, shrimp or sardines might? What justification can an Epicurean have in saying that he prefers one type of fish to another when Epicurus has said that the meanest fish allegedly produce as much pleasure as the fanciest fish? The question remains, did Epicurus really say that?
I have in front of me, Cassius, I'm on the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, and there's a black and white photograph with Henry Ford on the right and George Washington Carver on the left. And the description is that George Washington Carver and Henry Ford shared not only an interest in using agricultural products in industry, but also some quirky ideas about diet. Here, they share a sandwich of, quote, weed spread, unquote, made with wild bergamot, narrow leaf plantain, purslane, pigweed, milkweed, dandelion, lamb's quarters, and wild radish. They shared this meal at Ford Motor Company's George Washington Carver Nutrition Lab during Carver's 1942 mid-war Dearborn visit. So making a sandwich out of weeds is not to my appetite. And I think it's absolutely correct to say that people have the ability to distinguish between things that give them more pleasure in terms of their taste and things that give them less pleasure. I think when we're talking about Cicero, I mentioned that, by the way, because Cicero mentions eating the cress. Cress is a plant of the cabbage family, but it doesn't look anything like cabbage. It's got a long stem and small white flowers and pungent leaves. Some kinds are edible and are eaten raw as salad. That's garden cress. I'm sure there are other kinds. There's watercress and broadleaf cress. I don't know the differences between all of these things, but basically people are eating weeds. So we have to deal with this. Some of it's probably quite tasty. My dad grows microgreens, which are quite tasty, but I think Henry Ford and George Washington Carver are going a little too far. The question is, given what I just said, which is that we're endowed with senses. One of those senses is the sense of taste. The sense of taste allows us not only to determine what things are healthful and what things are foul for us to eat, it also allows a gradation in sense of what is pleasant or wholesome, and a gradation in sense of what is foul or disgusting. And we register this as pleasure. So clearly it's possible to favor one type of food over another. And it's possible to prefer to your taste the richest viands to the most plainest and simplest garden weeds, I think. The question then is, how do we connect that back with Epicurus's broader conversation about not just pleasure, but about self-sufficiency? And if you look to the letter to Menoikeus, it's in that context that we have part of that conversation. So you mentioned Don. So I'm on Don's translation and commentary to the letter to Menoikeus. I'm on page 15, and Don translates around section 131. A simple meal of hearty, wholesome bread and spring water delivers the most extreme pleasure whenever food and drink have been brought to bear against hunger and thirst. And when extravagant experiences do come up every once in a while, they are experienced more intensely by us, and we are better able to fearlessly face the vicissitudes of fortune. And it's immediately after that that he says this almost more controversial sentence. He says, therefore, whenever we say repeatedly that pleasure is the goal or telos, we do not mean the pleasure of those who are prodigal and those stuck in delighting in pleasures arising from circumstances outside of ourselves, like those who are ignorant, those who don't agree with us, or those who believe wrongly. Now, I think we've dealt with the second part of that, but we can go back into it if you want to, this issue of when we say pleasure, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal. But the first part, when he says a simple meal of hearty, wholesome bread and spring water delivers the most extreme pleasure when food and drink have been brought to bear against hunger and thirst. So there is a precondition here to this. And if you've been on a long hike in the mountains and you get to drink some water, suddenly that water is the best water you've ever tasted. So I think there is some truth to this. But to say that water is tastier than wine in general is something I'm going to probably disagree with.
Yes. And Joshua, the last thing you said there reminds me of a rule I try to apply, is that if it appears that Epicurus is saying something that appears to be defying common sense, then that comes into conflict with our presumption that we're studying Epicurus because he's a smart guy who does have common sense. And so if he appears to be saying something that seems contradictory to us, there's something else going on that explains what he's saying. Because Epicurus, if you take the position that he's a philosopher worth reading and studying and following, is not going to say something that conflicts with common experience in such a way as to make himself look ridiculous. He's got some kind of perspective on it that he's inviting us to look to and understand, while at the same time not overturning the obvious pronouncements of the senses, which are the foundation on which he's erected his whole philosophy. So again, we started off by looking at the way Cicero is describing this here, and Cicero is not placing his statement in the same context as what the letter to Menoikeus has said, because Cicero's sentence was, quote, he declares that no less pleasure is derived from the poorest sustenance, or rather from the most despicable kinds of food and drink, than from the most rare, delicate, whatever word you'd like to translate, recherche seems to be what Reed uses, dishes of the banquet. So somehow you have to reconcile that Epicurus has the same sense of taste that most everyone else has, and he can distinguish between a shrimp and an eel, just like Don can, and that he can prefer the one to the other, just like Don can. And yet Cicero is trying to say that no less pleasure is derived from either one of those two in general. I think there's got to be a problem with the way that Cicero is failing to put it into context of what Epicurus is saying. Because Cicero is trying to say, as he says in the next sentence, that if Epicurus declared that it made no difference to happiness what kind of food he lived on, he would agree with him. So Cicero sees a context in which you could say that it makes no difference to happiness what kind of food you eat if happiness is something besides pleasure. What Cicero is saying is that the problem is if you define happiness to be related to pleasure, then you've got to relate it to taste. Now, is taste the only pleasure that is at work in Epicurean philosophy? Clearly no.
Okay, so the consistent problem that we're having with Cicero is that he thinks that pleasure from Epicurus's point of view is so completely momentary and one-dimensional that we're all just running around bumping into walls trying to gratify ourselves each and every moment. Epicurus talks about this in a far more sophisticated context, and that's why DeWitt says that while people didn't stop talking about pleasure after Epicurus, he so completely reformulated the understanding of that word that everything that came after him was a response to what he said in some way, either affirmation or denial. In the letter to Menoikeus, which is where this quote that I'm thinking of comes from, Epicurus is talking about simple pleasures in the context of self-sufficiency. So let me take an example. There's a quote from Henry David Thoreau, another one of my favorite writers. He says, "I would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to myself than to be crowded on a velvet cushion. Presumably, in ordinary circumstances, all other things being equal, you would prefer the cushion to the pumpkin. But there's a twist here. There's already somebody on the cushion. So do you wedge in there and try to grab a spot for yourself, or do you just sit somewhere else that's almost as comfortable? It's not as comfortable, but it's almost as comfortable, and be happy with that because you aren't sharing it with someone." It's when you have aggravation competing with satisfaction that you have to start making choices like this. And one of the greatest sources of aggravation is the fact that we generally are people of limited means. And so what Epicurus says in the letter to Menoikeus is that most days of your life, you eat simple food. Not only does that protect your self-sufficiency, which is a huge boon to your pleasure in other areas of your life, but it also means that when you do taste the eel next time, it's going to be even better. It's not this momentary one-dimensional aspect of pleasure. It's pleasure considered much more broadly. And I think that's the main problem we've been having through this whole text with Cicero, is he just doesn't understand that or doesn't want to talk about it in those terms.
Well, he's using a classic legal lawyer argument approach of taking things out of context and making them look ridiculous when isolated from the circumstances in which they make a lot of sense. That's a very effective technique, but it's something that I think we have to get used to seeing and realize that it's not just Cicero that's doing this. We run into the same type issues today when people take Epicurean philosophy and turn it into an ascetic viewpoint of life that would make a medieval monk blush in terms of how much asceticism they want to seem to go after. Just like there's controversy over the translation of, I think it's Vatican saying 73, but the general way it is translated is that to err on the side of frugality can be just as damaging as to err on the side of luxury. The point is not to live a frugal life. The point is not to live a luxurious life. The point is to live a pleasurable life. And in the context of the definition of pleasure which Epicurus gives, which is not just simply the stimulation that Cicero focuses on, but is also a healthy, confident, but non-stimulated type of appreciation of existence. There's all sorts of types of pleasures that sum up to a total life of happiness. And that's the context in which Epicurus is always talking. He's never talking only about pursuing these stimulative issues of the continuous banquets and fish and so forth. He's telling you that's the wrong way to go. But he's also not saying that you simply throw out all pleasure and go towards asceticism, because he's got a definition of pleasure that allows you to pursue both as the circumstances allow, which ought to be clear when you start out the analysis the way that he does around line 129 of the letter to Menoikeus, when he says we call pleasure the beginning and the end of the blessed life. We recognize pleasure as the first good innate within us, and from pleasure we begin every act, choice, and avoidance, and to pleasure we return again, using the feeling as the standard. And then the part that should make it most clear of all is that since pleasure is the first good and natural to us, for this reason we don't choose every pleasure, but sometimes we pass over many pleasures when greater discomfort accrues to us. And similarly, we think many pains better than pleasures, since a greater pleasure comes to us when we have endured pains for a long time. So the goal is always pleasure, even though you are occasionally choosing pains in order to get to the goal of summing up these pleasures to the highest total that's possible to you under your circumstances. But Cicero is not allowing that kind of analysis here. He's just saying, well, if it tastes better, that's what you should go for. Just like he's previously said, length of time is a problem for Epicurus. Cicero is always attempting to isolate individual items and not allow the big picture that Epicurus emphasizes to take its place. And of course, we can flip over and do the same analysis on the pain side, because Cicero points out that he's got good friends himself. His friend Gnaeus Octavius, who wasted away on a long occasion and all his limbs seemed to be on fire. I think we all do know people who go through intense pains that are lasting for quite a long period of time. And Cicero is throwing those out there What are you trying to tell me that your little formula about pain that is intense is short and long is manageable, that little formula doesn't do anything when I have friends and I myself have been in situations where you go through long periods of intense pain. How am I supposed to take that formula as a remedy for pain? If you're talking about the kind of pain that's fatal as soon as it seizes you, Cicero says, who dreads such pain as that? I want you to tell me how to deal with the other kind of pain, the type of pain that is both intense and long, which we all see around us. And so in response to what Cicero is saying here, I think you've got some material from the DeWitt book, Joshua.
I do, under the chapter called The New Hedonism, and we've been quoting from that quite a lot recently. On page 244, he starts a new subsection called Continuous Pain Impossible. And this is kind of going to give you DeWitt's take on what Cicero is saying there. He says, having laid down the two principles that pleasure and pain are true opposites, and that continuous pleasure is a possibility, Epicurus was forced by a necessity of thought into positing that continuous pain is impossible. Principle Doctrine 4, pain does not prevail continuously in the flesh, but the peak of it is present for the briefest interval. And the pain that barely exceeds the pleasure in the flesh is not with us many days, while protracted illnesses have an excess of pleasure over pain in the flesh. And DeWitt says, this is among the more unfortunate doctrines of Epicurus and rightly incurred the sharpest ridicule. It reveals more faith in doctrine and more determination to live by it and to maintain control of experience than is consistent with medical knowledge. He seems to have been reasoning from his own malady, a stone in the kidney, which is accompanied by spasms of extreme agony, separated by long intervals of immunity. And then DeWitt says he had taken this stand, however, and continued to maintain it. So if Norman DeWitt is critical of Epicurus, you know we're on difficult ground here. Do you have a response to that, Cassius, immediately?
Yes, Joshua. I think what I would do is say that, as usual, when I criticize DeWitt, I think he's not following his own leads aggressively enough. Because my initial response to this is that I don't think DeWitt is giving Epicurus enough credit for taking his positions to the proper logical conclusion. He starts out what you just read by saying that Epicurus was forced by necessity of thought into positing that continuous pain is impossible. I think that's exactly what Epicurus was looking at. And he was saying that continuous pleasure is possible in life because you have an understanding that pleasure is not just sensory stimulation, but it is also your appreciation for existence even when you're not being stimulated. And that your mind is able to understand that these other things that are pleasurable to you are reason enough to continue living because they are worth having. Now, Epicurus is not a magician, and Epicurus can't guarantee that pain won't intrude into your life at times. But I think what Epicurus was saying is going to relate back to what Torquatus talks about in terms of leaving the theater when the play has ceased to please us. The point that Epicurus would have been concerned about is that continuous pain is impossible. And continuous pain is impossible because, as Epicurus says, even in the letter to Menicius in section 126, but the many at one point shun death as the greatest of evils, and at another yearn for it as a respite from the evils of life. And so Epicurus knows that death can free us from continuous pain. So even though that's an extreme condition that you're not going to want to choose unless you absolutely have to, I think that fits Epicurus's perspective that neither nature nor men can sentence you to continuous pain forever that you can't get out of, because either it's intense and short, or it's manageable if it's long, or if it is unendurable, you have the option of leaving life and thereby escaping continuous pain. Now, that's not going to be the method you're going to want to follow. You're going to want to avoid death as long as you can continue to live pleasantly. And as Epicurus says, it's a very little man who has many reasons for ending his life. But the doctrinal issue is that continuous pleasure is possible through the management of your experience and your mental and physical pleasures. And the flip side of that is true. continuous pain is not something that you are forced to endure. Necessity is an evil, but we have no reason to live by necessity. If we're in a position where unendurable pain confronts us and there really is no way out of it other than death, death does allow us to escape continuous pain. And so from that point of view, which is absolutely true, continuous pain is impossible. And I think that the problem comes when people do, as Cicero is doing here, they trivialize what Epicurus is saying here into implying that, oh, you can just mentally wish away your pains and think about the good things in life, and that's going to make the pain go away. And it doesn't. It didn't for Epicurus. He could still say that he was happy because he was aware that he had more pleasures than pains in his life in general, but that didn't get rid of the pain of his kidney disease. If you can't cure the pain of the kidney disease and it becomes unendurable for you, then you can exit the theater when the play has ceased to please you. Again, all the different cautions that need to be said, we can repeat when we talk about end-of-life decisions. But even though that's a very controversial issue, end-of-life decisions and so forth, I think that Epicurus has very clear things to say about that death is not an evil, that we do not suffer continuous pains after we die. We don't experience pleasures or suffer pains, but death can bring us the end of pain. I think it would be a mistake to ignore that clear line in Epicurean philosophy. So summarizing, Dewey continued on. He had taken this stand, however, and continued to maintain it. There's another saying extant which is supplementary to the former, quote, acute pains quickly result in death. Protracted pains are not marked by acuteness. In protracted suffering, the principle of the subtraction of pain from pleasure holds good. Upon this notion depends the calculus of pleasure. The title is neither ancient nor precise. It's no more of calculus of pleasure than of pain, and it more rightly should be called a calculus of advantage. The right way to judge all the pleasures and pains is by measuring them against each other and by scrutiny of the advantages and disadvantages. And for me, one of the lines that really hits this home as much as anything else is 125 of the letter to Menicius, for there's nothing terrible in life for the man who has truly comprehended that there is nothing terrible in not living. To me, if you take that and think about it and see where it goes, that is why Epicurus can say that the Epicurean is going to be stronger and more confident and have a more vigorous approach to life than somebody who is always worried about the possibility of pain overwhelming him. Because the person who knows that there's nothing terrible in not living always has an escape hatch if somehow he comes into circumstances where tremendous, unrelenting pain is confronting him.
Yeah, when you put it in those terms, well, I guess I should say when Epicurus puts it in those terms, I can applaud when he says that there's nothing terrible in life when you understand that there's nothing terrible in the end of life. It's certainly the case among the Greeks and Romans that they had a more free conversation about this stuff than we did. Seneca said that the road to freedom is always before you. If you don't see it, turn over your wrist. I do have to apologize. I realize this can be sensitive to some people, but it's part of the cultural conversation and we have to deal with it. Now, it's March 10th when we're recording this. On March 31st is the anniversary of the death of Titus Pomponius Atticus, Epicurean and friend of Cicero. Outlived Cicero by several years. And on his biography on Wikipedia, it says, Atticus lived out the remainder of his life in Rome. Just after his 77th birthday, he fell ill, and at first his ailment appeared minor. But after 3 months, his health suddenly deteriorated. Deciding to accelerate the inevitable, he abstained from ingesting any nourishment, starving himself to death, and dying on the 5th day of such fasting, which was the 31st of March in the consulship of Domitius and Sosius, that is, in the year 32 BC. He was buried at the family tomb, located at the 5th mile of the Appian Way. What makes this interesting in the case of Atticus is that he had managed to endure pretty much all of the political struggle at the end of the Roman Republic, lived to the ripe old age of 77, which a lot of these guys didn't, and suffered his last illness and died in a time of, for him at least, a time of peace. When you take another case, the case of Cassius Longinus, his sort of falling on his sword was done in a time of war and after having failed in his main cause. So it's maybe a little less applicable to what we're talking about. But Atticus's case is right on point with what you're saying, Cassius. I'm not advising people to do this. I'm not saying that the pain you're experiencing is so horrible that you need to do this. And I also don't feel entirely comfortable living as I do in a time of widespread easy access to prescription painkillers, looking down on people who didn't have access to the pharmacology that we have and making those decisions.
Right, Joshua. Let me also quote where this has been said specifically by Torquatus in Book 1 under section 15 to show how Cicero is leaving out this aspect of it when he's talking about intense pain and saying that these remedies are ridiculously insufficient. Because what Torquatus has said in section 15 of Book 1 is this, quote, "The same account will be found to hold good of courage. The performance of labors, the undergoing of pains, are not in themselves attractive, nor are endurance, industry, watchfulness, nor yet that much lauded virtue, perseverance, not even courage. But we aim at these virtues in order to live without anxiety and fear, and as far as possible to be free from pain of mind and body. The fear of death plays havoc with the calm and even tenor of life, and to bow the head to pain and bear it abjectly and feebly is a pitiable thing. Such weakness has caused many men to betray their parents or their friends, some their country, and very many utterly to ruin themselves. So on the other hand, a strong and lofty spirit is entirely free from anxiety and sorrow." That's the lead in. Here's the point that's relevant to what we're talking about right now. Quote, "This strong and lofty spirit makes light of death, for the dead are only as they were before they were born. It is schooled to encounter pain by recollecting that pains of great severity are ended by death, and slight ones have frequent intervals of respite, while those of medium intensity lie within our own control. We can bear them if they are endurable, or if they are not, we may serenely quit life's theater when the play has ceased to please us." Now, that's the point that wraps all of this together and doesn't just try to pull the pain issue out of context and say that, well, you're crazy if you think that you can just mentally will away your kidney stones. The full picture is that we're talking in principles here about what you're generally going to encounter in life, that the pains you're going to encounter are generally going to be manageable. If they're not manageable, then by definition, if they're not manageable, then you're confronted with the issue, are you sentenced to unendurable pain that has no way for you to get around it? And the answer is no. You're never sentenced to unendurable pain with no escape as a human being, because there is always escape as a human being if you truly do find yourself in circumstances that warrant that escape. Many people, and you're talking about today with the drugs that we have and all of the different influences around us, we're constantly dealing with these issues that we think are beyond our control. But that's why this issue of determinism and free agency and so forth are so important with Epicurus, is because he had a different set of problems than we face today. But he's insisting then, and I think an Epicurean would insist today, that you're never forced against your will without respite and forever to endure the kind of pain that you can't find a way to deal with. There are ways to deal with everything in life. In most cases, it's going to be, if you're confronted with a terrible situation, there are ways out of almost any circumstance. What Epicurus is saying as a matter of philosophy is that as a matter of philosophy, pain does not have the power to hold you in its grip without any escape and forever. You are the one in control of your life. The wise man can find more reason for joy than for vexation, Torquatus has said. And the wise man, if faced with an unendurable situation, also has a remedy at that point of his life as well.
I think we can also put that in the context of something that came along later. There were ideas of it already in Epicurus's time, and he was responding to them, but no one has quite invented an afterlife that was quite like the Christian understanding of hell. Pointless torture forever. It's not rehabilitative. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't accomplish anything. And it is totally inconsistent with a being that is alleged to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. One of the many reasons that Epicurus challenges the prevailing religion of his own time is he says that the things that are attributed to the gods are totally inconsistent with what the character of such a being would be. And I think that's even more so in the case of what was to come. And the problem of hell continues to be, I think, a real challenge to Christianity.
Okay, let's begin to wrap up. Let's go around the table and see if we have any final thoughts on this question of whether an Epicurean has any problem distinguishing between greater and lesser pleasures and greater or lesser pains. Martin, do you have any problem distinguishing between greater and lesser pleasures and greater and lesser pains, even though you think highly of Epicurus?
Yeah, of course not, because Cicero has misrepresented Epicurus' thinking here.
And you see no contradiction between what Epicurus has said versus also distinguishing between greater and lesser pains and pleasures.
Yes.
Okay, Calasini?
I think it's important to consider how prudence can be employed when one is navigating through life, and that requires considering the outcome of what one chooses to do. So there's a lot more layers to the whole thing than just saying, oh, you're going to choose between eating sardines versus wild salmon. We really have to consider the long-term well-being of our lives. So it really just depends on your particular circumstance.
Joshua?
Well, I don't think Don will ever forgive me if I don't talk a little bit more about this bread and water issues. Let me quote what he has to say on page 73 of his commentary to his translation of the letter to Menoikeus. The two key words here are maza and hydor, which has become hydro in a lot of words that we use, of course, meaning bread and water. And Don said a number of commentators point to these two words to insist that Epicurus and all those who lived or studied in the garden ate only bread and water. I have always been curious about which kind of bread was being referred to. It turns out it is maza, which was an ancient Greek barley cake or a thick barley porridge, as opposed to artos, a cake or loaf of wheat bread. Maza could be a quick, hearty, simple meal all by itself. And more importantly, it was the kind of dish that people ate every day. Today, we think of bread and water as being like prison food. But when it's like the daily meal that people eat all over the country every day, it becomes a little more ridiculous to think that they are ascetics, which is Don's next point. He says, the idea of eating only bread and water seems Spartan and ascetic to us. But bread and water, or probably more commonly bread and wine, maza and wine, was a meal in ancient Greece. And to me, it's a lot like saying, if I had oatmeal for breakfast this morning, that doesn't just mean I had oatmeal, right? I could have put other things in it. I could have put blueberries or fresh fruit or honey into my oatmeal and still called it oatmeal. So I think there's probably a cultural context in reference to this bread and water issue that people miss out when you go onto the internet and read what people have to say, which is that they only ate bread and water. Epicurus is on record asking for a friend to send him a pot of cheese so that when he likes, he may dine sumptuously.
Joshua, that's a great lead into what I wanted to say next before we close too, because we haven't talked about Vatican saying 33. Let's relate it to what you said. So the pot of cheese reference is dining sumptuously. That's apparently a fragment, not a lot of context around it, but all we really know from it is that there are certain circumstances, at least, in which Epicurus thought that a pot of cheese would allow him to dine sumptuously. At least in my own mind, I've often combined that with Vatican saying 33, but it doesn't go with it necessarily. 33 is, quote, the flesh cries out to be saved from hunger, thirst, and cold. For if a man possess this safety and hope to possess it, he might rival even Zeus in happiness. So I was combining those incorrectly in my mind. And there's not a saying that says that Epicurus says all he needs is a pot of cheese and water, and he can compete with Zeus in happiness with that pot of cheese. So I would relate that to what we've been talking about today, that when the Epicureans talk about competing with Zeus in happiness, they're not necessarily saying that eating a slice of bread is the same thing as eating an eel, to use Don's analogy. Different things produce different types of pleasure. that have to be factored into the total of your experience. So that to imply that all you need in life is bread and water, I think would be a gross miscarriage of what Epicurus is saying. If you conclude from that once you get bread and water, you should stop. Epicurus is quoted to have said that the wise man can be happy even while being tortured. I think it would be wrong to conclude from that observation that the wise man should be satisfied to be tortured, that he wouldn't want to get off the rack, that he wouldn't want to stop the torture. There's always this interplay, it seems to me, between how much is enough and this calling to pursue pleasure that is clearly stated throughout Epicurean philosophy, that nature calls us to pursue pleasure, and how much pleasure is enough. And there are very interesting issues here about how these things interplay. But what Cicero and the opponents of Epicurus end up doing is to take things out of this overall context of pursuing the overall life of happiness in which many types of pleasures are combining with many types of pains. And he's trying to isolate certain passages that make it sound like that Epicurus is a nitwit, that Epicurus has no common sense, that he has no common experience in thinking that all pleasures are the same or that all pains can be ignored. Cicero and Epicurus's enemies use that as an attack against him. And I think we should take from that a warning that we ourselves should not fall for the same problem of taking things out of context. Epicurean philosophy is a systematic view of the world and how to live. And just like people will say about the Bible, that it's possible to prove anything out of the Bible by finding particular passages, you can do somewhat of the same thing by looking at the principal doctrines and the writings of Epicurus. And by taking things out of context, you can go off in a direction that I would submit would be very inappropriate from what Epicurus was really suggesting.
First of all, it was Diogenes Laertius who quotes Epicurus as saying in the letter to a friend, when you like, send me a pot of cheese that I may dine sumptuously. So since we've been quoting from the letter to Menoikeus here, I should quote how it ends. And again, this is from Don's translation. He says, meditate day and night then on this and similar things by yourself as well as together with those like yourself. And never, neither awake nor in sleep, throw yourself into confusion. And you will live as a god among humans, because no person who lives among eternal pleasures is like a mortal being. So that's a very high-minded sentiment, and coming as it does at the end of Epicurus's longest surviving text on ethics and pleasure and so forth, needs to be understood in its context. And it's a context we're constantly trying to delimit here. And one of the reasons our conversation with Cicero has been so fruitful, I think, is it gives us a good chance to defend these ideas against an adversary who was certainly hostile to them. But Epicurus's advice at the end of the day is meditate day and night on this and similar things by yourself as well as together with those who are like yourself.
That's a good place to end, Joshua. That's what we do on a regular basis at the Epicurean Friends Forum. We'll close our episode for this week, but come back next week and continue talking about much the same kind of argument from Cicero in section 29. Drop by the forum if you have time and let us know if you have any comments or questions about this or anything else we've discussed about Epicurean philosophy. Thanks for your time today. We'll be back next week. Bye-bye.